Thank you all for being here. Jonathan is getting some well-deserved rest on vacation, so I'm taking over tonight. And just a reminder, we're recording as usual. This will be posted on YouTube after proper editing, and the session is going to last around 90 minutes. The structure is going to be around 40 minutes of presentation. It's totally up to our presenter, Katherine. And then roughly a 25-minute breakout in different rooms, and then a Q&A plus discussion of about 45 minutes. And with that, I'll hand it off to Peter to do an introduction of our speaker tonight.
Thank you so much, and thank you to Katherine, of course. Thank you to everyone for the attendance. Katherine's work has come up several times, actually, quite reliably, I would say, in student discussions of the future. What happens we've done this for several years, but what happens is we put up a series of themes and areas of research for students, and then they go away and they pick what they find the most interesting topics. And Katherine's work is fed back to us quite reliably, as I say, by different student groups over different years. It's interesting that in a way, it's interesting in a way that they are not picking up, say, a dedication to AI as much as to well-being. Certainly in the groups in which we've been researching this, both in Ireland and in the MBA classroom in Loughborough. So, thank you to everyone. This is actually a joint presentation with the Loughborough Centre for Information Management, and thank you to them for their support. Katherine herself is speaking to us from inside of a store in Australia, and goodness knows what time it is there, but thank you so much for the effort, Katherine. Just by way of background, then a member of and advisor to the Club of Rome, strategic advisor for the Centre for Policy Development, economic strategy advisor to the Next Economy, a writer at large at the Edinburgh Futures Institute, thinker in residence, job title I would so much love, at the Australian National University's Planetary Health, a new economic senior fellow at the Zoe Institute, fellow of the Post-Growth Institute, and a distinguished fellow of the Schumacher Institute. Welcome, Katherine. You are indeed welcome.
Thank you, Peter, and hi everyone. Really wonderful to be with you. As Peter said, there's a bit of a storm outside, so I'm hoping that won't affect the internet too much. It has already before you joined, so apologies if I blank out. You'll know what's going on, but hopefully it'll come back. But I have to confess, this is my first Cybernetics audience. I'm really delighted to be with you, and I'm really quite amazed and so humbled that the themes that I work on around economic system change are resonating, and I'm really very much looking forward to our discussion and the breakout groups and so on. What I'm going to try to do is a bit of an overview of the wellbeing economy agenda, with some examples of what it looks like in practice from the perspective of government and from business. And then I'm hoping, given that we've got a nice chunky time to discuss together, we can then dive a little bit deeper into areas that you're particularly curious about. I will also say that don't see this as a one-off and then that's the end of the conversation. If there are things that you are particularly interested in, or you want references for anything that I say, more than happy for Peter to pass on my email, and I can follow up with references and so on. So yes, let's see this as the beginning of the conversation too. And while your topic of cybernetics is sort of an unfamiliar terrain for me, I feel a little bit at home because I know Loughborough relatively well, because my husband's family is from nearby, and so many a time when I used to live in Scotland, driving through Loughborough, particularly on a Friday night, having left Glasgow in the morning by the time we get to Loughborough. So I feel I'm amongst familiar audiences in that respect at least. I will now pull up my slides and hopefully we can get going. If someone can just give me a quick thumbs up that you can see the slides, wonderful. So And just to let you know, one of the things that's really beautiful in Australia, and I think very, very appropriate, is that when we start conversations like this, it's become customary to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from First Nations unceded land, and the land that I'm on is from the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. And this is a photo from a hill that's just behind my house, very much in better weather at the moment. But I think it's important to take a moment to pay my respects to the First Nations people who can still take care of this wonderful land that I'm on. So in terms of the context to the wellbeing economy agenda, there's a lot of things going on in the world that mean that more and more people are starting to question the nature of the economic system and how fit for purpose it is. One of which, of course, is the climate crisis, of which obviously is just one aspect of environmental breakdown. We're seeing biodiversity crisis, ocean acidification just in the news this week. But it's hard to avoid the reality that the Mother Nature is hemorrhaging under the pressure that humanity is putting on her. And we're also seeing huge inequalities. These are two Australian images. The photo on the left at the time was the world's most expensive cocktail. It's called the Churchill. It's from a bar in Melbourne. And at the time, it cost over $12,000 for one hit of a Churchill. And then, so we're seeing huge capture of wealth at the very top of the income and wealth distribution. And when many, many other people are struggling to put food on the table, as you can see so poignantly with this cartoon on the right. To me, it's a cartoon that just so powerfully captures what any statistics I could roll out for you. And you'll probably be familiar with some of the figures in the localities and countries that you're from in terms of, wealth really going to the top, and that myth of trickle down just not happening. But I said earlier that humanity is hemorrhaging under the pressure that humanity is putting, or the planet is hemorrhaging under the pressure that humanity is putting on her. But that, of course, is a bit of a flawed statement because, of course, it's not everyone. It is not all humanity. And this is research done by my former colleagues at Oxfam. There's similar research done by others. But you can see here is that CO2 emissions mapped by income decile, so it's consumption-based CO2 emissions by income decile globally. And you can see, rather ironically, I think it resembles a champagne glass, a little bit like the same glass that the Churchill cocktail came in. And it really starkly shows you that the top 10% of people, which probably be, globally, many of us in this room, the ones who are responsible for over half of the world's CO2 emissions. So it's huge inequality in terms of who is putting most pressure on the planet. And you bring that together and we see a world that is really creating despair. And I think almost every day it's hard to avoid examples of that. And what I think we have evidence of is many, many people are reaching for coping mechanisms. Sometimes that's at the metaphorical pillbox, turning to sort of drugs and alcohol and so on, or, retail therapy. But it's also, of course, at the ballot box, people reaching for simplistic solutions offered by, populist politicians for the fact that their lives feel out of control, lack of, alienation from each other, the atomization of communities. And one of the great systems thinkers who you may have already come across in your course, the late Donella Meadows, I think sums up the predicament and the challenge quite powerfully, where she says things such as hunger and poverty, environmental degradation, and so on. These persist in spite of the analytical ability and technical brilliance that have been directed towards eradicating them. And I think that's a sort of fairly fair comment, isn't it? That lots of people have been working to make the world a better place for decades and for centuries. And she says they still persist because they are system problems. And her challenge is, she says that these are characteristics of the system that perpetuates them. And her call to arms to us, really, and to change makers and change agents around the world, is to see the system of the source of its problems and then find and I love these words, the courage and wisdom to restructure it. And so when we talk about the system, I often think that it's worth channeling, as I say, our inner 3-year-old. So if any of you have got sons, young sons or daughters, or grandsons or granddaughters or nieces, nephews or so on, and you probably remember when they're about 3, 4 years old, they go through the stage where they're constantly asking, but why? But why? And it can be a little bit annoying when it's your young sort of nephew, is my case. But I think we need to channel our inner 3-year-old and really constantly look at these aspects we're seeing: hunger, chronic disease, drug addiction. Channel our inner 3-year-old and ask why, what is going on behind that. And when you keep asking why, you find yourself facing the economic system. And I think what we're seeing in a lot of policy discussions is almost an economic fundamentalism, where the economy is being seen as the goal in its own right, and society and the environment are being subordinated and positioned as in service to the economic system. And so some of the realities, and I guess these are almost intellectual toeholds that I'll offer you at the moment. These are some of the concepts that I find really useful to grapple with the way the economic system is operating in countries like the UK or Australia, where I'm now based. One is the idea of diminishing marginal returns. And if any of you have studied Economics 101, you'll be familiar with this concept, but I'm giving you the example of salt here. This is the idea that a bit of salt in our diet is really helpful, but too much of it can be unhelpful and unhealthy. And same it is with economic growth. And there's different ways of looking at this, but you can see here on the x-axis is GDP per capita, and on the y-axis is life expectancy. And what you see is at early stages, along the left-hand end of the graph, at early stages of economic development, you get fairly good returns in terms of increases in life expectancy, but they start to tail off. And you can see this in other ways. This is a composite index now on the y-axis, something called the social progress imperative. And again, you can see good returns in terms of social progress at early stages of economic growth, but they start to tail off. So you get, for example, you can see Costa Rica there up in the top left-hand corner, same level of social progress as South Korea, same level of social progress, but huge difference of about $20,000 in terms of GDP per capita. I would put a caveat on that though, because when I say you get good returns, it's contingent. And that's often what's required is that GDP and economic growth being used to invest in our collective institutions, things like health systems, education systems, sanitation. Vanilla, you're just talking about your water. So it's so important that that growth is used to invest in those sort of public institutions that really enable things like life expectancy to rise. And it also needs to be pro-poor. And that's not automatic. There are plenty of examples of countries around the world where they've had GDP growth at the same time as poverty going up or inequalities getting worse. And then we also have a misalignment between the, I guess, traditional measures of success and the reality of people's lives. And you only need to think about what you're hearing from, say, there in the UK, from the political leaders around prior to the election. Keir Starmer was saying his missions are going to be growth, 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 measuring success on GDP, incremental increases in GDP quarter on quarter. And yet that bearing very little resemblance to the reality of people's lives. We're also, and I think this is really a powerful one, so often social policy tends to put the onus of responsibility and the onus of change on the individual, and sees, where's the unit of change need to be focused on is the individual here. And this cartoon, I think, sums it up so beautifully. Whereas, why is this little koala stressed and anxious and shaking? Because her habitat has been destroyed, not necessarily because she has a mental health problem. And yet the focus is on something wrong, something pathological with the individual. And that almost shifts our gaze away from the economic system. And then what happens is we spend a lot of money collectively downstream after the fact in response, repairing and fixing and healing damage that has been done by the pursuit of economic growth and, that economic fundamentalism agenda. And there's a term that I want to share with you. It's a term I find very, very useful called failure demand. And I don't know if anyone's come across this term before, but it comes from management literature. For a chap called John Seddon. And over 12 years ago in Scotland, there was a huge commission onto the future of public services in Scotland, really looking what are the different demographic changes and so on that are going to impact Scotland's public services. And that research took the term failure demand from management literature and brought it into social policy and said, look, so much of the different layers of government and what they spend on is driven by things like poverty and inequality. And once you start looking at government announcements and you have press releases from governments and so on, you will see examples of this everywhere, whether it is increased spending on homelessness shelters or increased spending on in-work benefits because people are not earning enough to put food on the table, whether it's winter fuel payments. I know that's a discussion in the UK at the moment because people's incomes are not enabling them to keep warm in winter. But also we see in winter that you've got warm sanctuaries. Here in Australia, the City of Melbourne has just appointed heat officers to provide shelter for people who are vulnerable during what's going to be more and more frequent, very, very hot summers. The Treasurer here in his most recent budget has been announcing huge budget increases for rent assistance, for disaster response payments, increasing money going to the community sector because of increased demand for their services, and so on and so on and so on. Ecological economists in the sort of realm of the environmental space will talk about defensive expenditures, spending after a huge oil spill, for example, or a huge flood, or cleaning up after a huge bushfire, which is all too familiar here. And you think of the layers of that, the insurance payout, the emergency services overtime, the repair of buildings, the increased trauma from individuals who've been sort of kicked out of their properties and had their homes destroyed, the health impacts because of asthma exacerbated by smoke, all of that has a price tag. So there's a fiscal price tag to this that is getting quite substantial because these are ultimately avoidable costs. And again, like I say, you'll see this everywhere when you look at government announcements. So what could be better? And so this is where the idea of the wellbeing economy comes in, that people are increasingly talking about. And to be honest, it's been quite beautifully surprising to many of us in the movement to see how the concept of the wellbeing economy has really taken off. There's different ways of describing the wellbeing economy. To me, one of the most simple ways is it's really an economy that's explicitly designed to meet the needs of people and planet. You might describe it as sustainable well-being. You might describe it as flourishing within planetary boundaries or social justice on a healthy planet. But essentially, it's saying, what sort of economy do we need to enable the people to live the lives that they want to in a sustainable way, in keeping with needs with ecological health? I want to just pause for a moment before I go through the sort of policies and changes that are required to build a wellbeing economy and talk about the word well-being. And I feel a bit bad saying this because I know you're recording it, but my confession is I don't like the word well-being because it's a very, very broad term and it has lots of different connotations. There's a beauty parlor or beauty salon down the road from me that does pedicures and spray tans, and it calls itself Your Home of Wellbeing, is advertised on the sign. There's recently, I get news alerts. And I often get news alerts saying that the Hyatt has just opened its new wellness spa. So let me reassure you, this is not about wellness. This is about quality of life for all people now and into the future and for all species. But let's pause. I used to really be quite critical of the idea of subjective self-reported well-being as a preeminent measure of progress. And probably about 20 years ago or so, or 15 years ago, I wrote a blog that said too much focus on individual subjective well-being. So essentially individuals reporting how happy they are. I warned that was a little bit like turning up the volume on your headphones while a riot rages around you. And then soon after I wrote that blog, and I'm not claiming any causality here, the car company Audi published an ad, and you can still get it on YouTube, called Escape. And basically the storyline of this ad is it's set in, I think, a sort of metaphorical East Asian context, and you can see all this fighting going on, all this sort of ninja moves and so on, and it's really horrible. There's fires and there's violence, and it's utterly awful. And then this chap who's part of that escapes into his Audi, and miraculously a glass of champagne comes into his hand, and there he is in his car, and you can see the violence and the fires outside, and his feet warmers come on, and then the song Easy Like Sunday Morning plays in this ad. And to me, this really encapsulated the frustration I felt with a sort of really narrow focus on individual well-being, because there he is, protected in his Audi, he's got his feet warmers on, and he's got his glass of champagne. His subjective well-being, and you can see on his face, is probably quite good, and yet the context outside is literally where a riot is raging. And so to me, when I talk about well-being, it's very much about collective and societal, and taking into account how is society faring, how is everyone doing, and not just focusing on individuals in isolation as if they could just take themselves out of society the way this chap is with his car. I also want to make emphasis about the material basis of well-being. And if any of you have looked in your local newsagent recently, and seen the suite of magazines, there is a whole plethora of magazines with titles such as wellness or happiness or well-being. And this is a magazine that I noticed a few years ago, and it said your top tips to how to get well-being. So I picked it off the shelf and I sneakily took this photo of the table of contents to get a sense of what they were prescribing for well-being. And their prescriptions were things like take your dog for a walk, go to a yoga retreat, go to a Buddhist meditation in Thailand, go for a jog, have your friends around for drinks, which all is fairly reasonable, sounds quite nice, a great life. But my concern is that if you are being evacuated by your house because of an extreme weather event, you're not going to have time to do meditation, though that's probably exactly what you need. If you are living in an area where you feel unsafe going out at night, you're not going to be able to go for these nice jogs or take your dog for a walk. If you are living on a sort of multiple jobs just to keep your food on the table and above the breadline, having friends around for drinks is going to be a real challenge, let alone going to a Buddhist retreat in Thailand. And so to me, it's all very well to have these sort of prescriptions, but if people do not have enough economic security, economic resources, they're going to be very challenged in meeting those basic requirements of well-being. So to me, the material basis of well-being is really critical to remember. And that's where it comes back to the economy. Who is the economy serving? And is it giving people enough resources to build the sorts of lives that they want to live? And to me, it's a very quite contrasting to related concepts that you may have heard of around sort of empowerment and resilience. And I think about you've probably heard the resilience a lot. It's quite popular amongst policymakers. If someone imagine someone carrying, as this chap here is, a huge amount on his head and in his hands, carrying some burdens. So the resilience response would be help individuals withstand those shocks and those punches. Then, of course, there's the empowerment agenda, which would say, let's help that person carry more burdens. Let's empower them to carry more of those burdens. They are both about changing the person. Where the wellbeing economy response comes in, it is about saying, how can we lessen those burdens? Where do those burdens come from? What holds them in place? And who benefits from their existence? So it's about training our gaze on the wider circumstances, the conditions in which people are living, and understanding some of the dynamics behind them. So it's not to be derogatory to empowerment and resilience, but it's a yes and conversation. You've probably heard many, many other concepts thinking about how can the economic system be designed differently. I don't think of the wellbeing economy as an alternative to those concepts, certainly not a competitor, not even a synonym. I see the wellbeing economy as operating almost on a sort of humbler plane, as a little bit like a picnic blanket underneath all these different concepts. And many of you will probably be familiar with these to greater or lesser extent, and they all resonate with different audiences and they have their slightly different emphasis, but very much at their core, they all have a sense that the economy should be about serving the needs of people and planet. And when I say what are the needs of people and planet, the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, which is a group I co-founded a couple of years or several years ago now, they have almost crowdsourced from their movement members what are the things we need the economy to deliver. And I suspect these will be quite familiar for you. You might have different emphasis, you might use different language, but why I think they'll be familiar and probably intuitive is because they resonate with a lot of deliberative democracy exercises. They even resonate with the findings of, say, neuroscience and psychology around what makes people thrive and flourish. And when people really given the chance to reflect on what most matters to them, they come up with these sorts of things. So here, what we all has distilled are things like dignity, so everyone having enough to live on. So that's very much about the material basis of well-being that I was talking about. Fairness is around the distribution and justice in all its dimensions, so sort of horizontal and vertical inequalities, and how can the economic system deliver that? Participation, really making sure that communities and citizens are engaged, having a sense of purpose and dignity. This is a basic fundamental human need. Even when people in the most distressed situations, a sense of purpose and belonging is utterly critical. And of course, recognizing that we are not on top of nature. We are part of nature and nature's inherent value. To give you an example, though, of the deliberative aspect of this, and there are plenty of examples of where consultations have been done with communities, asking various iterations of the question, what makes a good life for you? What is well-being for you? Those sorts of questions. This is work done by some of my colleagues at a group here that I work with here in Australia called the Next Economy. And they worked in a place called the Latrobe Valley. And Latrobe Valley is a place where the massive coal-fired powered station is closing down. And so the community is going through a huge process of economic change. And so the Next Economy worked with the community to think about, okay, what would good look like beyond the horizon of relying on this coal-fired power plant? And again, even in this one community, what they've identified as their priorities are sort of things that resonate with those 5 needs that I've just shared with you. So things like people and planet prioritized, our community members being able to influence decisions, communities feeling engaged, collaboration, people having the resources that they need, and so on. And I suspect you'll be able to find, maybe in your local community or in the country where you're based, similar versions of these sorts of conversations that really resonate, show that almost there is a fundamental human needs around what we need the economy to be delivering for us. So how do we go about building this sort of economic system? A sort of economic system that really speaks to the needs of people and planet. You may already be thinking, my goodness, this is going to require a lot of changes across a whole wide suite of areas, from the local up to the very supranational, from how we grow our food, design of buildings, our transport systems, energy systems, tax systems, what nature of businesses, and so on and so on. And you'd be utterly right. I tend to think of it as a little bit like a jigsaw puzzle of multiple shifts and changes, none of them sufficient on their own, but together having potential to add up to a different economic ecosystem, one much more aligned with what people and planet need. And if any of you are fans of jigsaw puzzles or were turning to jigsaw puzzles during COVID lockdowns, most people, when they're doing a jigsaw puzzle, they start with the corners. And so I get my head around that plethora of shifts that's needed for a wellbeing economy by thinking about the 4 corners, these sort of, we can cluster cluster those changes into 4 corners of the wellbeing economy, and I call them the 4 Ps. So they all start with P. So they are purpose, prevention, pre-distribution, and people-powered. And I'm going to go through these just briefly for you now. And so purpose is saying, well, we should be fair weather friends of economic growth, not its ever faithful followers. Not just assuming that if we grow the economy big, that will automatically, or grow the economy faster in GDP terms, that will automatically be the solution to all the challenges. But it's also requiring that we untangle means and ends. Economic growth shouldn't be the ends in itself. It should be a strategy in the right circumstances to help us deliver the sort of outcomes that people are really, really after. So it means shifting the conversation from just the rate of growth to saying, well, what do we need more of? What's the composition of that growth and what's the direction of it? So what are the sort of economic activities that are aligned to what people and planet need? So decent jobs, having healthy, affordable housing, having transport systems that are affordable and clean and accessible and so on. What do we need more of in the economy? And what, if we're really honest, do we need to power down because they're not aligned to what people and planet need? And just in the last 24 hours here in Australia, our government has just announced the opening of 3 more coal projects, despite all the evidence. They're the sort of things that should be powered down. And yet it's this idea that we need to grow the economy. So of course we need, that sort of economic fundamentalism in that cartoon that I showed you earlier. And the sort of practical things that you'd expect to see in this corner of the jigsaw puzzle are sort of maybe beyond GDP initiatives, multi-dimensional wellbeing dashboards, of which many, many governments have their versions of these. So if any of you are based in Scotland, Scotland has something called the National Performance Framework. Here in Australia, we've just released something in the last year or so called Measuring What Matters, a dashboard of different indicators to go beyond just focusing on those narrow economic fundamentals that we saw in the cartoon earlier. In fact, over 2/3 of governments across the OECD have these multidimensional wellbeing frameworks. So our colleagues in statistics are working on bringing to the fore a whole wider range of different measures of progress and saying we should broaden our gaze and look at things like health of rivers, financial security, quality of jobs, and so on. And you're also seeing this at the sort of more micro level with the rise of for-purpose businesses, which I'll come back to in a moment. The next P, is around prevention. And we were talking earlier about failure demand and those avoidable costs. Prevention is about saying, well, yes, of course, that downstream response is utterly critical in the short term because that's helping people and planet survive and cope. So again, I don't want to be seen to be derogatory for that work, that servicing of acute needs. It's utterly critical. But the wellbeing economy agenda is about saying, well, survival and coping is important, but it's not enough. We need to look at system change. And so if we channel our inner 3-year-old, if we ask why, we look upstream to the nature of the economic system. And this means taking action there. So for example, doing what Donella Meadows was calling us to do, have the courage and wisdom to restructure the economic system. So this means things like maybe the more jobs pay enough to live on through things like living wages, the less governments will be having to write budget items for in-work tax credits or increased budgets for rent assistance. The more circular our production and consumption systems are, the less we'll be having to do beach cleanups on a Sunday morning. The more the jobs give people a sense of dignity and purpose and control and fulfillment, so really basic human needs, the less GPs will be having to write prescriptions for anti-anxiety treatments. So you get the picture of, how can we be more ambitious in terms of looking upstream and taking action there. The next corner of the jigsaw puzzle is pre-distribution. And this is essentially saying, how can the market economy do more of the heavy lifting in terms of delivering the sort of outcomes that are necessary from the beginning? So governments around the world do quite a bit of redistribution through taxes and welfare. They moderate the gap between rich and poor. That requires a lot of political argy-bargy, a lot of political machinations, often very fraught conversations, a lot of stigmatization in this agenda. In the UK, We've had conversations around, strivers and skivers. Here in Australia, there's been horrible discussions around welfare recipients as lifters and leaners. This is about saying, let's go beyond that and think about how can the market economy generate more equal distribution of resources from the beginning. And so the sort of things you would see in this corner of the jigsaw puzzle might be, again, living wages, maybe even maximum wages, worker cooperatives, for example, where you have workers owning the capital. The community wealth building agenda. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with this agenda, but this is essentially the alternative to trickle down economics. It's saying, how do we build the economic activity from the community up through things like local ownership, local employment, local procurement, those sorts of things. Also, we might include in pre-distribution things like true cost accounting, so that we're really understanding the real cost of items and our goods and services. So for example, my mobile phone, when I bought it, I bet you it did not really include the environmental costs of the production and consumption and the transport of that phone, let alone the social costs of the wages of people who had to generate the materials that are in it and work in the factories to produce that phone. So it was artificially cheap because it externalized many of those costs. So true cost accounting would start to bring that in. So we see the market prices giving much more accurate signals of the reality of items. The final corner of our jigsaw puzzle is people powered. And this, of course, matters for its own sake. I mean, who is the economy working for? We have to have people at the forefront of this, people feeling empowered to take decisions that affect them. And so things like participatory budgeting, citizens' assembly, economic democracy, where you have, say, workers on boards or various communities even on boards of companies, really making decisions about economic flows, economic changes that impact them. This matters for its own sake, but it's also sensible tactics, because we can see around the world and in the UK examples of what happens when communities feel done to, where they feel that changes coming upon them are outside their control and they quite naturally dig their heels in and resist. So this is important for its own sake. I want to turn now to what this means for government, and then we'll finish by looking at enterprises and business. So government has a really critical role, but let's start with sort of getting the component parts in order. This very simple chart to me illustrates a bit of a hierarchy. So the first one, if you look at the top right-hand corner of this chart, what's the ultimate goal? That we have, social justice on a healthy planet, meeting the needs of people and planet. The wellbeing economy then is the penultimate goal. The wellbeing economy is not the goal in its own right. It's this sort of economy we need for our higher order goals. Then we need a government that's really embracing this agenda to enable that sort of economic ecosystem to emerge by changing the rules of the game, using different levers, different instruments that governments can pull to structure and encourage certain behaviours to emerge in the economy. And I'll come to that in a moment. So that means really looking at what are the goals of government and what are the processes of how government takes decisions. So to dig into that last item a little bit more, in this chart, start on the left-hand corner. So this is the ideal sequence. So you start with a conversation along the lines of what sort of country do we want to be? If any of you are from Wales, Wales did this really well as part of their Future Generations work. They had a big public consultation around what sort of Wales do we want? Then once you've got sort of the vision and what matters, then you can say, okay, how are we going on that? And you can do that multidimensional wellbeing framework or wellbeing dashboard that I talked about earlier to see across a whole lot of different goals and dimensions, how are different groups faring, how are different aspects of the environment faring. So you might look at various aspects of social justice or economic equality, or how the health of different aspects of the ecosystem. So these are our multidimensional wellbeing dashboards. And as I said, over 2/3 of the OECD governments have got these. So it's clearly that's where there's a bit of momentum, but it's clearly not enough, because are over 2/3 of the OECD countries becoming wellbeing economies? Not really. So what you need to do then is make the measures matter. And that's when you come into, okay, how do we change the way government operates? So how do people working inside government channel their inner 3-year-old, look upstream, figure out what are the root causes of those different inequalities that are revealed by the wellbeing dashboard, the root causes of ecosystem breakdowns, and then design different ways of working and different policy design. So really using the different instruments of government, legislation, so banning things, regulation, tax systems to encourage certain behaviors, subsidies to really increase the sort of economic activities that are important and to power down those that are not. And then you get using the budget instrument. And this is, of course, where the previous government in New Zealand under Jacinda Ardern really got quite a lot of global attention, because they brought in what was called a wellbeing budget around using the different instruments of fiscal levers to spend where attainment needed support. Very happy to go into these different elements in a bit more detail, but let's in our discussion. But let's have a little bit of examples of what sort of policies might resonate, might be helpful in changing the economic ecosystem. I will give one caveat. If you were to search for policies by putting the word well-being in, say, a policy database, you won't find the best policies. The best policies are unlikely to have the word well-being in them. What you need to look for are policies that are starting to change the economic ecosystem so that it generates more justice, more equality, better lives for people, better jobs, and so on. I want to give you a few examples from Scotland, partly because I lived there for 20 years, but partly because over the last decade or so, the Scottish government has been embracing this agenda. And so they have some good examples of the sorts of things that you might see on that jigsaw puzzle. So we talked about the 4 Ps. This is a slide from the Scottish government slide deck where they mapped some of their policies against those 4 Ps. So you can see down the left-hand side here, they've got purpose, prevention, pre-distribution, and people-powered. And they've given some examples in this table here. So for purpose, as I've already mentioned, they have their National Performance Framework. Well, it's a whole suite of different measures, things like children growing up loved, things like the gap between rich and poor being reduced by better distribution of power and wealth, different diverse communities feeling supported. Care economy is a new entrant to that as well. So broadening the gaze of what policymakers focus on beyond just a narrow focus on GDP. Around prevention, you can see things like their fair work agenda, increasing the circular economy in Scotland, just transition to net zero. They have something called the Scottish National Investment Bank, where they're trying to increase certain activities that are aligned to particularly environmental sustainability. In pre-distribution, they've got now a minister for community wealth building, and there's a community wealth building bill going through the Scottish Parliament. They've been looking at different business models and saying we want more cooperatives and more social enterprises in our economy, and how can they go about increasing that. So a report on that, it says here a review. That review has just been published a few weeks ago, and you can dig that out on the Scottish Government's website. And in terms of people powered, they have had citizens' assemblies, which I've been really blessed to be part of in the last few years. They have a Community Empowerment Act where they're transitioning ownership of assets to communities and really doing a lot of co-creation. So there's just some examples there of the sort of things that one government is bringing in to support those different 4 Ps. Another example, I've mentioned Wales, and Wales had a public consultation. They came up with these different goals for Wales, 7 different areas they wanted: a prosperous Wales, a healthier Wales, a globally connected Wales, a sustainable Wales. All public agencies in Wales need then to figure out how they can advance those goals. And I think what's a really nice element is they also have these really lovely ways of working. So things like collaboration, prevention, thinking for the long term. But other governments have got their own examples. So Sweden, for example, has reduced the VAT that you pay if you're repairing goods. So this is a good they took it down from 25% to 12.5%. This is a great example of something really obvious lever to increase and encourage the circular economy. In France, they have banned short-haul flights. So if you can get somewhere by train in less than 2.5 hours. You can't fly there. So again, starting to change what's on offer in the economy. Italy, and probably some of you might be familiar with the Emilia-Romagna region in northern Italy, that has a huge number of cooperatives. A third of the regional gross domestic product comes from the cooperative economy. They have more gender equality, more economic equality as well. And Italy for a long time has had this law that's about supporting the ecosystem around cooperatives. So again, trying to encourage cooperatives to make up a higher proportion of the economy. In the state of Oregon in the US, they have started to tackle economic inequality by saying to companies based in Oregon, right, if you want to pay your CEOs a sky-high salary, that's fine, but we're going to tax you. And you can see in the bottom here some of the different ratios of average CEO workers, to median workers. They're going to increase the tax that comes in. And again, I think that's a really great example of governments just saying, how can we encourage different behaviors? So you're seeing that through banning things, you're seeing that through tax incentives, you're seeing that through investment in the ecosystem to encourage certain behaviors. So let's go to businesses. And I love this quote I want to share with you around what the purpose of business is. It comes from the British Academy. And they say the purpose of business is to solve the problems of people and planet profitably. So profit is the sort of the means rather than the end in itself, but not profit from causing those problems. So not profit by generating things that then need spending through failure demand. As I said, that's from the British Academy. And I think it's a really nice sort of nuance to add over what is the purpose of business. And my confession to you is that the phrase the business community is one of my least favorite phrases, not because I'm anti-business. I love business, but because the phrase business community, it sort of implies that business is this one homogeneous group, that it's all the same. And of course, that's not the case. So we have the good, the bad, and the ugly in businesses. So during COVID, Australia's famous airline Qantas behaved pretty despicably in that they sacked a whole lot of workers and they just treated their staff like rubbish. So you've got that behavior on the one hand. And at the same time, and again, I'm a bit biased, so I like Scottish examples, whiskey distilleries in Scotland, when COVID hit, whiskey's distilleries said, you know what, we know how to make alcohol. We're going to turn our distilleries and our production into creating that alcoholic hand gel that was so urgently needed by the NHS. Two very different sorts of attitudes to that collective problem and different behaviors. And in fact, the Harvard economist Herad Sabiti has said, actually, we need to recognize what he describes as the emerging fourth sector of a whole wide range of different business models, of different types of approaching enterprise that are bringing purpose in. So they're saying, yes, we need to be commercially viable, but we're going to do so in a way that's got a higher purpose. So yes, profit, but profit is the means rather than the ends. So to give you a couple of examples of the cool sort of things you will see, another brilliant Scottish example. This is on the island of Bowmore. Some of you may have been there. It's very famous for its whiskey. These folks were doing circular economy before it was cool. And what they have is that the island of Islay and the Bowmore distillery, which is one of the local distilleries on Islay, they were using the heat from their whiskey making production to heat the local community swimming pool. And they just were doing that naturally. And these are the sorts of things that you get when communities are in the same place and they're seeing those very obvious opportunities. In Glasgow, this is a company called Green City Whole Foods. It's been around since the 70s, and it's a worker cooperative. So all the staff there own the firm and they take collective decisions, and they have a really strong mission to reduce their environmental footprint, but they're in business to take care of their staff, not to make profit for remote owners. And I think, again, it's a great example of the worker cooperative movement. I was complaining about my phone to you earlier on. This is an example, Fairphone. Some of you might even have a Fairphone. It's a Dutch company. They've just been figuring it out. They're quite new, but the latest model, I'm told, is pretty good. And the whole premise of the Fairphone business model is that it's modular. So I used to have one of these Fairphones, and when my camera broke, I wrote to them. I said, my camera's broken. They posted off to me a new part and a fabulous tiny, tiny little screwdriver so that I could undo my phone and replace the camera. I couldn't do that with this rubbish piece of thing that externalizes the cost. So Fairphone's a good example of saying we want to be part of better use of resources. They're also all conflict-free and sort of have very high labor standards in their supply chains. This is an example of a restaurant in Sydney, so just up the road from me. It's called Ree, and their tagline is that everything you touch would have gone to landfill. And so all the alcohol that they're making these beautiful looking cocktails out of would have been thrown away by other restaurants. Or the food is made from ingredients that other restaurants would have thrown away. Even those rather trendy looking bar tops that you can see there, they're made from old Tupperware that again would have been on a skip. So that's their whole essence, is to cherish things that would have been thrown away and keep that circular economy in production. These are nice, relatively small examples, but there are a few bigger examples here. So again, another Dutch company, Triodos Bank, who my UK bank, I have an account with Triodos. They're a B corporation. And their mission really is to channel financial resources, a bit like the channel energy to the sort of economic activities that we need more of. So renewable projects, for example. This is, again, you're going to see my Scottish bias. This is an Edinburgh-based company, but many of you probably have these beauty products, shampoos and shower gels in your bathroom because they're quite common across the UK. They have appointed to their board someone whose job it is to represent nature. So at board decisions, someone is sitting there and speaking up for the needs of nature. Even a massive company like Microsoft is saying that they want to be carbon negative by 2030. So take out the carbon that they've produced in their decades of existence. So some really interesting examples there. And these conversations are starting to slowly make their way into the mainstream. One example of this very recently is a report here around the new economy, talking about how to respond to the poly crisis. And it talks about the different things that are needed to change the transition around sufficiency, circularity, systems thinking, redefining values, and putting equity and justice. So the sort of things we've been talking about here. So a sort of report that anyone really in the wellbeing economy movement could have written. But yet this report was written by Ernst & Young, one of the massive major consultancy companies. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that everyone working in Ernst & Young is embracing the extent of system change needed, but I think it's very, very interesting that companies like Ernst & Young are starting to publish these sorts of reports. I think it shows that this agenda is really starting to align with people's recognition that business as usual can't carry on. I want to finish by a lovely final example of what this means for business. And this is a great report published by colleagues in the Wellbeing Economy Alliance around the craft brewing sector in Scotland. And they were looking at the idea of local production around how different ways of doing business can just better meet the needs of local communities. And they found that these craft brewing, they weren't about growth for its own sake. They're about taking care of the locality, employing local people, collaborating with each other. So craft brewers see themselves as a sector where they collaborate and they share recipes, they share sustainability ideas, but they see themselves as in competition, not with each other, but with the big brewers. So they want to bring together that quality of craft beer. And they see success as the craft, not as the growth in itself. And so this chap, if any of you go to Scotland, you can go to his beautiful little brewery. It's just outside Glasgow, and it's called Jaw Brew. And he was talking about, would he want to just grow his business? And Mark Hazel, his name is, and he was reflecting on this. And he said, well, do you know what? If I grew my business, that would be great, because then I could afford to have on-site bottling, and that would reduce the environmental impact of transport for bottling. So if we did it here, we could reduce our environmental impact. But then he said, but I wouldn't want to get any bigger than that, because if I did, I'd be in the back office doing the accounting and the budgets, and it would take me away from the craft of making the beer, of which I love. He also, I think, gets up every day thinking about how to make his business more sustainable. On beers, you get those sort of plastic rings. He's trying to work out how to make those plastic rings out of prawn shells. He's capturing the CO2 from the production process. And he has a line of beer that's made using bread from a nearby bakery that would have been thrown away. He is a great example of the sort of business that we want more of in a wellbeing economy. I think Peter and Miguel, I've gone way over my time. My apologies for that, but really looking forward to the discussion, everyone.
Great. Totally the contrary, Catherine. I feel privileged to listen to this presentation. So, given the time, I think it might make sense for us to head straight into Q&A and discussion with everyone here. Does that sound all right to you? Great. There are a number of comments that have come up in the chat. A few from James about economic figures from both Wales and Scotland. A mention of Lawrence Lessig, his idea around citizen assemblies, and a comment by Aaron Van Kampen. So, James, I would like to challenge you. You posted quite a few comments there on the economics situation in Wales and Scotland. Do you have a direct question for Catherine?
I've got a comment, I guess, more than the question is that, I mean, you're using Scotland as an example, but the Scottish government has just been replaced. It's broadly failed across educational needs for children. It's got high levels of child poverty. It's been kicked out because it's been failing because it's been focusing on ideology as opposed to actually delivering to the people. So I'm a little bit confused as to why you're holding it out as a really good example of potentially creating an economy by going about things in the right way, when evidently, as far as the people are concerned, it isn't.
So let me pick up on that. So one, they're not perfect. They haven't created a wellbeing economy, and there's a lot of countervailing forces. What they offer, I think, is examples of thinking differently about how the economy can operate. So the fact they've brought in their national performance framework, which has been around since 2007, and they've been refining it over several iterations, and it's a cross-party agenda. So they have support across all the other parties in Scotland as well for those broader suite of priorities. But it is a challenge because often you get asked, well, what impact can this make? And you can have great examples of policies and different shifts. But when countervailing forces, such as wider economic changes across the UK, undermine that and sort of take the wind out of the sails of those individual examples, it's very hard to see a distinct impact. One example where you can see an impact is the community wealth building agenda, and where that's been brought in most fulsomely is in the town of Preston. So I don't know if any of you know Preston well, but of course they've had for a long time been led by Matthew Brown, and he's basically, I think, really pragmatically saying, how can we use the spending that the local government's going to be doing anyway to keep that locally? Recent research has found that they've been more resilient through the sort of economic turmoil of the last few years. Things like mental health has gone up. People's subjective well-being has gone up. It's still problematic. It's not perfect yet, but I think what you're looking for is not unilateral delivery of this, because we won't find that at the moment. No one has delivered this perfectly, but we're seeing examples of the sort of individual policies being put in place. And Scotland certainly has those examples, but it doesn't mean there's not other big, fierce debates in Scotland, doesn't mean there's not countervailing forces, doesn't mean there's not critics either. There has been quite a bit of opinion polling in Scotland showing that across the board and across different political support, people are very supportive of the wellbeing economy elements and the agenda writ large. So when you talk about ideology, there's some, obviously there's the independence case and there's some other issues that are quite to the fore in Scotland at the moment. But in terms of these sorts of policies, they do get fairly good polling.
But the point, if I don't mind, the point is that all these things, the economy, you're talking about the global economy on the one hand, and the global issues on the one hand, and then you're talking about very, very small, isolated things that haven't worked. Okay, the well-being economy might be a nice idea, but it hasn't worked in Scotland. It hasn't worked in Wales. The people from Wales have to come to England to have NHS appointments because the Welsh government have failed to deliver the NHS. Both of the things, the thing in Scotland and the thing in Wales, were in control of the Scottish government and the Welsh government. They weren't dictated by Westminster. So you can't say, I'm afraid, that it was because of other things going on. They had total control over it. Now, if we take the hypothesis as being a desirable one, then it's taking part in a system. And unless you change the system as a whole, the rest of the system will recorrect these things because the context drives a self-correcting process where things will norm back to all the other factors in it. So it might be a nice idea, but there isn't really an example here. There's lots of tiny examples of people being able to do isolated things, which is applicable on the broad scale and on the broad spectrum, as far as I can tell, that you're talking about, the global economy and the looking after the planet and everybody being equal and so forth. I can't see how these small examples translate to being effective on a larger scale.
So James, I mean, I think we should have other voices in this discussion.
Sure, by all means.
But I would challenge you that I don't think I talked about just good examples. I talked about from the global right up to local to the local. So yes, local is often where some of the most innovative sort of trailblazing work happens. But I also talked about national policy change. I talked about big companies. You need several layers of changes to happen. You need mindset change, you need policy regime change, and you need practice change. And without one or the other, individual isolated policies are going to be vulnerable, as you say. So I utterly agree with you. And I think what's happening is we're seeing individual examples, individual cases, individual practices that prove it's possible. These are the pioneers that are going against the grain of the wider system, but they're still putting in place the sort of shifts that are needed. But as you're saying, and I utterly agree, until we change the mindsets of how the economy is thought about, they're going to be very, very isolated and vulnerable to being, picked off and kicked out. And so that's the change that this agenda needs to lean into, is really bringing about a shift in the conversation around how we think about the economy. So I agree with you that it's not enough, but that's where we are today. And I often get asked, are there any countries that have created a wellbeing economy? No. As I said, none of them have done that yet, but they're starting to put in place different pieces of that jigsaw puzzle. The task now is to sort of join them up, roll them out, and have that shift in mindset to make them secure. And so that requires a whole lot of different interventions. It requires people rolling up their sleeves and just building examples, those pioneering examples. It requires people inside government, of which there are many, many people inside different governments who recognize that business as usual is not good enough. But it requires change, and this is why I shared with you the Ernst & Young report. It requires change in how we think about the economy. And if places like Ernst & Young are starting to think about that, the World Health Organization are doing a lot of work around the wellbeing economy. Even the World Economics Forum's report at Davos this year was very critical of a carte blanche approach to growth. So you're starting to see these questions being asked. And yet, as I said, it doesn't mean that this conversation is happening. And I'm pretty depressed seeing the political debate in the run up to the UK election with, Keir Starmer's just growth without really thinking, what's the means and ends here. So we've got a long way to go. Not under any illusions that we're there yet. But I think I conceded that and talked about those different examples in the talk.
David, I see your hand raised.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Katherine. I thought that was absolutely wonderful. I'm annoyed that I haven't sort of encountered the Wellbeing Economic Alliance earlier. So the but is, how do you get there? And what I've put up on the comments is, how do we create a narrative for my fairly well-disposed MP to be able to say to her mate, Keir Starmer, look, the public will be more impressed by let's say, a dashboard economic management system than by GDP, or even if you're really sophisticated, GDP per capita. And as James would say, people understand single linear numbers, even if they're highly manipulative, and there's lots of paradoxes within them, like GDP. I mean, do we simply have the dashboard and then average out the elements of dashboard, some kind of more sophisticated measurement? But I mean, I remember all the green shoots around the Occupy movement, what, 12, 15 years ago, and they're a little bit higher, but you know, it's I wouldn't say it's more a jungle out there, it's more a wasteland out there still. And I'm not convinced that, you know, I mean, craft, for example, is still sort of getting the government to pass legislation degrading food quality. And my dad sat on the UK food industry lobby group for decades, so I've got some understanding of the evils within the system. The second point is, we talk about system change. Donella Meadows was brilliant. However, doesn't it all just come back to evolutionary biology? When we're hard pressed, we're selfish buggers. And we create systems which rationalize that and call them the devil or capitalism. You know, maybe we need a bit of moral reformation, or to sort of eliminate the top 5% or something, or I wouldn't say cut population growth necessarily, but my son's carbon impact is probably equivalent to half a dozen Nigerian kids' carbon input. So that's 3 questions, you know, choose whatever.
David, there's lots in there, from, you know, stickiness of GDP to our selfish, you know, human nature, power of vested interests, and what we should do with it, the richest top echelons of society. I'll pick up on a couple, and again, I'd love others to sort of comment and respond directly as well. So GDP is profoundly sticky, despite the fact most economists really recognize its flaws, and how it's, you know, the perverse incentives bound up in GDP, and how, when you say, you know, GDP per capita, as you mentioned, that averages out the wealth and the poverty. But it is a simple indicator that people think they know what it means, and it's got, because it's apparent simplicity, it's, you know, it's got traction. It's also upheld by a whole lot of international accounting rules and internal fiscal rules within governments as well. And it's also become the proxy for international success. And you see a lot of work, you know, a lot of global politics and global geopolitics is, you know, the entry ticket to clubs like the G7 and the G20 is, how big is your GDP? And so that international prestige and decision making that comes along from it, you know, really has created a system where it is all pervasive. There are alternatives though, and there's a group called the Wellbeing Economy Governments that you could direct your MP to, of governments, Scotland, New Zealand, Finland, Iceland, Wales, and Canada. Australia is also part of that as an observer status, to learn from each other around what they are doing to put well-being, collective well-being, at the heart of economic policy making. So none of them have got it right, but they're all doing little different initiatives. So they're sharing those through policy labs. So direct your MP to WeGo. And I just, yes, your point around vested interest is utterly true. And it's one of the things that makes me, you know, when I oscillate from hope to despair, the power of vested interest is real. And so there is a task to build a movement behind this that is not just those who are already opting in. Yes, there's lots of supportive opinion polls, and I could share with you tons of opinion polling from the UK or globally around people's support for this agenda in various different ways. That's clearly not enough. So what we need is mobilization on a whole different level to get politicians to feel that they can stare down the pushback from those vested interests. And that's really challenging, but we see some examples where politicians do that. So one beautiful example here in Australia is where politicians stared down the tobacco lobby in terms of advertising in sport and in terms of plain packaging and so on. The hysteria they got from the tobacco lobby, and it would have been an utter disaster, but they are able to mobilize the sort of health evidence and to push through that. There's also some industrial relations reforms, and they're fragile and precious when they come through, but when politicians feel they have enough support of certain union movements, so there's been some good examples here in Australia recently, and so the question I hold is, how do we bring that equivalent of that support to support politicians feel they can stare down that pushback? Because a lot of them will get that business as usual is not working well enough for enough people. They'll recognize definitely the flaws of GDP. The final point around selfish human nature, yes, and I'm Australian, we are competitive, but we're also incredibly collaborative and cooperative as well. Humans are more than just one aspect of human nature. If you're interested in the top 5% question or top 1%, follow the work of patriotic millionaires, and these are folks who are, I'll shut up there so we have more time for questions.
Thanks.
Peter.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I found that fascinating. Not much of a question in a way, but just to kind of prompt you with one of the concepts you used, which I thought was extremely powerful, which is just this idea of failure demand. Failure demand is very powerful, isn't it, in the modern economy? And it's maybe a condition that we seem to set up and move into. Off the top of my head, the conversation we were just having about food, the NHS, policing, Richard's on the call, cybersecurity, CCTV, as the picture showed, on the streets, etc., and so on and so forth. I think we can paint quite a convincing and quite dystopian picture of advanced economies with this failure demand characteristic at their economic core. In other words, it's kind of a condition of the system. It's kind of what it does, Anyway, not so much a question, but maybe an invitation for you to comment. Thank you.
Sure. And of course, GDP will count as a positive spending on failure demand. So spending on anti-obesity drugs, or cleaning up after a huge bushfire, repairing those buildings that have been destroyed, paying for kids' asthma treatments because the smoke's got into their lungs, that will all be recorded as an increase in GDP. So when I talk about the perverse incentives bound up in GDP, that's an example of that. The late Herman Daly, who's one of the founding fathers of ecological economics, talks about uneconomic growth, when so much of what's growing is being spent on responding to that downstream collateral damage. And again, I don't want to denigrate it because it's utterly important, isn't it? When we haven't created a wellbeing economy, that spending is crucial to help people survive and cope. There's a report that the Wellbeing Economy Alliance published about 4 years ago, looking at the Scottish budget and the items there that you could construe as examples of spending on failure demand. But as I said, you will see examples of this when you just listen to government announcements. You'll see this everywhere. And of course, it's often easy, and this, I think, speaks to David's question around the way politics operates, that it's often easier for governments to write a check for something, or cut the ribbon outside the launch of a new hospital wing, to spend on all that downstream damage. Much easier for governments to do that. Even they will often cry that they're short of resources, but that is still the easier act for them than dealing with the imbalances of power and resources that system change requires. That's a reality of where this agenda is up. So it's easier to spend downstream because it avoids the conversation around challenging the structure and nature of the system. Yeah, but I'd encourage you all to call it out whenever you see it. It's not always the right, something to celebrate. Oh, we've opened a new food bank. Utter sign of failure.
I think it's well said, and it's very relevant in some of the research work I've had over many years. Really, is that effectively that's what we're seeing the system do. But anyway, let me hand over. I think Elena is next. Is that right?
Yep, Elena.
Thank you, and very interesting talk. What I'm interested in is, can we get more examples and more regulatory support for things like industrial symbiosis? Because that example of the swimming pool being heated is one. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit there, but sometimes there are actually regulatory hurdles. And the one thing that cybernetics can do is help governments write regulations that are helpful instead of cumbersome.
Awesome. Great. Great. And I mean, the point, and whether this is what you mean, but what your questions made me think of is, the potential of co-benefits and multiple benefits from policy making. So thinking, what example, an energy efficiency scheme, how much could that actually have employment benefits or inclusion benefits and poverty reduction benefits and so on. So thinking more broadly about the impact of a policy. You probably, Alana, be familiar with the work of Janine Benes, who does the sort of biomimicry work, and really taking that inspiration from nature to sort of see how nature just doesn't inherently create waste in the system, but really taking the ideas that a way nature operates and applying them to building design, for example. But I'd love to learn more about how cybernetics can offer here. So please send me examples or
Okay.
anything you're working on that's relevant to that. I'd love to learn more.
Great. Aaron?
Yes, hi, Katherine. Thank you for everything, for your talk. And I didn't see everything, but I did read that paper that was linked today.
Oh, wow.
By Anders Hayden, right?
Mm-hmm. So that paper by Anders.
So, as I say, a wise man comes prepared, right? So I put it in the remarks here in the chat that complex systems like society cannot be regulated nor controlled. Yeah, it's a complex system. So what I have been working on the last while is how to really control a harmful system which society has become, to make it non-harmful. Now you can ask the questions then. Okay, government and say, okay, all our policy will be all pointed to the non-harmfulness of our policies. For example, we should not harm life, well-being, the environment, and social cohesion. Those four things. So when all policies and all corporations and all businesses focus on that, it should be supervised, and we set up a people's lobby in Holland to do this. Mm-hmm. Then we have a feedback mechanisms, and we can correct the harmful policies. We can correct harmful effects. Very, very simple. We do not have to address every little company issue that man makes. It's too complex. He cannot, because there's 100,000 things, different things. But just simple, focus on feedback mechanisms, cybernetic feedback that will give us the information about the negative feedback, we call it, to correct harmful policies. That's all. And then you can ask yourself, you don't have to use sustainability anymore. Just ask yourself, can what man does become or be harmful? That's all. So I really simplified it. Then I put it in one slide, and that's it. And if people would if people would just follow that, then we do not have to ask if it's ethical, if it's moral, if it's good, or if it's bad. It's just, we observe the harmfulness or non-harmfulness. That's all. And when it's becoming harmful, we correct it by feedback. Problem solved.
I'd love to see that slide, Aaron. If you can circulate it or share it, that'd be great. I clearly have loads to learn about cybernetics, and really seeing just a glimpse of the resonance between your work and the Wellbeing Economy agenda. The Wellbeing Economy Alliance is something you might want to join. It's sort of almost like a community of people who in all their different spheres. So it's real diversity of membership there. People in the heart of government, people who are business leaders, people who are activists, people who are academics, all sorts, but who share that sense that they want to be part of a different movement and learn from each other and support each other and back each other in. And so it'd be great. You're all very, very welcome to be part of that.
Yeah. I put the link to the Dutch people. You know, if you want to
Brilliant.
and enjoy, it's going to be an international organization, maybe.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right, thanks. I will try to find that slide for you.
Oh, that'd be brilliant. Yeah, I'd appreciate seeing it and learning from it.
Great. I see a couple of comments by Frank. Oh, there you go. Frank, take it on.
Hi, Frank.
Thank you very much, Katherine, and also may God for giving me the opportunity to ask questions or contribute. I think it's a quite interesting topic that you picked this afternoon. Sitting here trying to figure out is this a way of empowering others or constraining power? So we have some people who are the government, they talk about it, but how do they redistribute power or distribute power with those that we are at the moment talking for? Because we have people at the bottom who are struggling to benefit from the well-being policies and strategies we are talking about here. So if we position the argument in here and then you say, okay, citing an example from the West, and I know you said quite a lot, but nothing has been said about, in my village, what is happening over the poor farmer working in my village, who probably perception and views of well-being is completely different from what we are talking about here. Are they interested in what will make them happy as opposed to what we consider as well-being? What is it that the government over there look at it as the dashboard indicators that will probably elevate what they are doing and then help them to get some sort of resource from the West to support your government, and then this kind of money do not go down to support people who matters. So when we come to the argument of we're talking about economic systems and then redistributing income and all that, I think the core issue here is to make people accountable. And I like what Alina said here, that we need to ensure that possibly we can regulate the support system. So that will come back to those who are in position of power should do more to support those who are suffering at the moment. I think that is the core argument. The well-being economy is just conceptualization. We are conceptualizing something and to say, okay, this is how things to be. If we can do that and roll it out to the global south, then we are making the headway. But not until then, I think people will continue to suffer. This is how I see it. So I myself, and then Peter, you've been doing quite a lot of work around how do we do that? How do we, in the complex system, ensure that those who hold power, control power, are the custodian of power, can share that power with and empower those at the bottom so that we can do to achieve what we want in the economic system. So that's a bit of contribution, but I think it's well packaged, well done.
Thank you. No, I mean, I think there's lots of almost points there to take as given, but you're right. This has to be about a shift in power in terms of how government operates, who is part of government, who decides what government goals are. The one thing I'd add to your point around how we define well-being is that when people are given a chance to really reflect on what most matters to them, it is often, really at the sort of most basic level, it is remarkably similar. And I've been part of deliberative exercises in really diverse locations around the world with my time with Oxfam, and it's actually it's one of the most hopeful things is how people in incredibly different locations share a real sense when they're given a chance to reflect on, so not just sort of opinion polling or rapid fire questions, but when they're talking about what makes a good life for them, what would they wish for their children. It's very, very similar. And that actually, to me, is a really beautiful aspect of humanity that we, there's something that makes us innately human around what matters to them. I think you might like the work of the late Chilean economist, Manfred Max Neef, who talks about fundamental human needs and different ways of satisfying them. I think his work's really, really useful in this context. But just to come back of how we make people accountable, I mean, I think what's the antidote to those vested interests that we were talking about earlier? And I don't have any easy answers, actually, because the power of vested interests and the power of the wealthiest, there's a huge confluence between power and wealth, isn't there? That, you know, the wealthy are able to design the system to, you know, acquire more wealth. It's what Donella Meadows calls success to the successful. They can design the rules of the game to perpetuate their status. And that, you know, to me, that the antidote to that is just things like that broaden up, open up government, changing how decisions are made and where those decisions are taken. So the agenda of subsidiarity, you know, so taking decisions as locally as possible, the participatory budgeting, but also people just not waiting for permission from government, but getting on and making these changes themselves also. And I know in different contexts that's easier said than done. There's different realities of being able to sort of just get on with change. So I'm not naive to that, but I think just we have to be able to, we as in this movement, when I say we, then it has to be about building a broader base and making alliances across other movements with faith communities and unions and, you know, other climate movements, gender justice movements, and so on, to build that countervailing power to the very entrenched power that has captured so much government. I'll leave it there because I know there's a few more questions. And I'm sorry, I'm not reading the questions in the chat. I just can't do both. So folks, sorry, I know Miguel pulling them out. Thank you.
Of course, don't worry. Yeah, Margaret, please.
Hi. So provocations, right? I was thinking, well, what would a bureaucracy do with your idea? And I thought they'd create a tick box mentality with it, right? And so basically it would be just yet another thing they have got to do, not a fundamental shift in their raison d'etre, the reason for their actual daily life.
Yeah.
And this is the big problem that we face, is entrenched old democracies are actually entrenched old bureaucracies. The second point is I'm originally South African. And what you see having happened there in the last 30 years is state capture of assets, incredible corruption, which is rife right throughout the global south, if you want to call it that. Whenever money is directed through governments, it never goes to the people, never. In communities, as soon as you put a man in charge, you won't get community development. You have to get the women involved. And my fifth comment is GDP was designed to exclude women's work. It was literally designed like that. So at some point, we've got to say enough. And I think kids today, when I listen to how they talk, they're actually really sick of it all. And I think this is what's happening when we get a more distributed system going, where it's more one-to-one financing of small projects by small people. There's human level accountability. You know, that hairdresser in that village or that farmer in that area who knows two people who've personally given their own cash to help him plant seeds or trees or whatever the case may be for 5 years' time. You know, and I think these are the kinds of relationships that you're trying to imply, if I may speak for you, in a sense of the local relationships. However, we're still sitting with these huge pyramid structures, which we call government. And I'm not sure that until we actually expand our definitions of economics to include well-being, if you like, not just GDP, so that 50% of the population can actually be included in the measurement, and children actually count as worthwhile, think, you know, something worthwhile to spend your time and energy on. I think that this is almost in a sense a little like trying to push against the breeze. And I hate having to say that because I'm an idealist, probably a utopian as well, but I'm deeply cynical. And I'm trying to sort of balance this all out and going, okay, I expect that we will have these lag effects where things are going to get worse as things try to shift. However, we're dealing with such huge instantiated systems that I'm really battling to see how our current democracies are going to actually manage anything like this, unless it's literally rebuilding the concept of community. Because certainly we don't have, even in this country, political systems that truly understand what a community is anymore. You know, there are some political parties in this country that don't even have the notion of society in their ideology. It's all individualism, you know, and business. That's, you know, etc. So I'm just sort of saying that there are multiple angles to this whole problem, or ways to where you can actually look at it and poke at it. And if it's not going to just be a sort of really lovely idealist utopian vision, it has to sort of find a way to, and perhaps some of the experience you had that has been had in Scotland. And I do note with some trepidation that it's all alcohol companies in Scotland, and so much more physical well-being, right, or mental brain well-being. But anyway,
there are other examples.
And also, you've got an NHS who just has to pick up the pieces from stuff like that, right?
Exactly.
Which nobody actually pays for, directly. So there are big consequences to that behavior when you don't feel the immediacy of your actions. And this is something that is human, I think. We really battle with more longer term thinking and then thinking in terms of consequentiality rather than just immediacy of what we perceive as need. And I think also when you've had so much of your mind kind of parasitized by this, you just need stuff mentality. You need more of this or more of that, or more, you know, that you can't live without your gadget, your this, your that, the next thing. Not that we could live without a gadget, but it becomes quite a problem, because then you start saying, okay, well, this is what equality means, is that everybody can communicate around the planet with each other, with whomever they like. However, the channels to do so are not open. They're not free for all, you know. So there are these huge problems, and democracy absolutely relies on open information networks. And that's becoming monetized. So I'm really worrying a lot about these kinds of icy, almost anti-democratic trends that we're moving in terms of our neoliberal economic agendas that are being played out in the West, especially. So I'm really worrying about that, without wanting to sound like an absolute weirdo, you know, for being so woo-woo about everything. But I really worry, and I'm really battling to see how something as fundamental as seeing to basic human needs, as Max Neef suggested, can actually even happen within the systems. I mean, it's just absolutely nuts that you say you want economic growth, but you're willing to burn and flood the planet for it. I mean, that's just an insanity. And yet that's what we're doing.
Yep. Agreed, Margaret. If people, Margaret's comments are around the sort of GDP excluding women's work, the person to look up there is Marilyn Raring, if people want further information. The one point, I mean, I just so much agree of one, what this is up against, but two, what the beauty of examples that are out there that show what's possible. But also the power of, the way advertising is turning, wants into needs and so on. And that's a whole other, session that we could have done together. The point at the beginning around the tick box, and I think it's very real as well, which is why mindset change matters as well. You need that cultural change as well, because you can have all the processes that bureaucrats need to respond to. If they don't get it, and if they're not excited by it and see how it helps their job, all those processes will just become stale at best. So there's really the need to change mindsets, and that's what the Future Generations Commissioner in Wales does a lot of, is really working internally within the Welsh Government. The town I live in, they have a wellbeing team they've done a consultation, they've got wellbeing framework, they're starting to do wellbeing impact assessments on policies and budgets, but they're doing a lot of work working with colleagues to help them make those connections between policies and understand what difference this makes. So it's not just a tick box exercise, but that's hard to do, but utterly critical. So I'll leave it there for the moment. But yeah, just agree with a lot of what you're saying, Margaret.
Katherine, by the way, it's extremely late, so you make the call as to when to end it. So I don't
we have
know how you're
one more
feeling
quick question.
I was going to
out.
suggest if John Waters is still around. John was having trouble putting up his hand, but if you want to ask your question, John.
No, I didn't really have a question. I had several hours worth of comments, so I'm not going to.
Great. I think one thing this is highlighting, though, is that there's economics itself is in play. You know, economics, the discipline, is being debated. The point that Margaret was just raising there about a kind of feminist economics. I don't know all of that, but the exclusion of women's work from the measures is just like one of those things that a Martian would see. You know, it's just like if somebody lands from Mars, they just see that, wouldn't they? You know, but we built a system around these two certain notions of productivity and certain notions of where wealth comes from. You know, again, I mean, Mariana Mazzucato, big name these days, but she very fundamentally challenges some of those assumptions. And then there's all the Keynesian stuff, the origin of the United States kind of stuff, and so on and so forth. So economics itself is in a sense stressing under the complexity of the problem that we are facing now, and different schools are emerging. For me, well-being economics is hugely convincing, partly because ultimately, you know, it's almost David's question, but ultimately it does link to self-interest. It just harmonizes that self-interest with group interest. And that subtle shift is very powerful indeed. You know, it's not group versus, not the individual versus the communal. It's a harmonization. And that is hugely generative.
Yeah. Just seeing some great book examples too, suggestions in the chat too. There were, especially Sand Talk and Braiding Sweetgrass. There's lots around that, and this speaks to your point, Peter, in that sort of there's economics and there's economics. There's so much diversity in the economics, scholarship as well, of people like Marilyn Waring being a great example, or Herman Daly, of people sort of broadening out, and yet it's what influences policy is the key question. Often that's a sort of very narrow type of economics thinking, and yet so many economists have been working on many of these issues for decades.
Yeah. And disagreeing with each other.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Great. Yeah, there are still a couple of questions, but just for out of respect, I think it's good if we let Katherine get some rest. Katherine, thank you very, very much for this presentation. I think the discussion itself is evidence of the interest you've generated here. So, Peter, any last words?
I think you put it extremely well. I think the discussion testifies to the interest you've generated here. And the last word is there's always a beer for you in Loughborough. Just give us 10 minutes.
I'll take you up next time I'm visiting my in-laws, for sure.
10 minutes notice. That's all we ask. And likewise, let me extend that invitation to everyone on here. But thank you so much, Katherine. Thank you for getting up so late, so early. And really wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Great debate.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Thank you for your thoughts.
Stewardship as well. Thank you.